Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Steve Joseph, the Vice President of Market Development here at ShareVault, and I'd like to welcome you to this webinar on selecting suppliers to help you build medical devices. A few months ago, as we started coming up with webinar ideas for March, we received very strong feedback on the importance and value of this particular subject topic, and now that seems to be reinforced by the number of audience registrations today. So again, we appreciate everybody joining us. Before we get to the presentation, I'm going to briefly cover some logistical items, describe ShareVault's role as a sponsor of this webinar, and introduce Maren Nelson, our guest speaker. Maren will then spend about 40 minutes on her presentation, and during the remaining time, she'll respond to audience questions. So now let's briefly cover some logistics. During the presentation, if you have questions that you would like Maren to address, you can submit them at any time through the questions box in your GoToMeeting control panel. We'll certainly try to get to as many of them as possible, but if we can't address all of them before the end of the hour, we'll forward the remaining questions to Maren so she can respond individually. Also, in case you can't stay for the whole presentation or you would like to go through it again, it is being recorded and you'll be notified by email when it's available, how to get access to it, and also how to get copies of the slides. So that's a very common question. People will ask, can we get copies of the slides? Yes, they will be made available, and you'll be receiving an email on how to get those slides. Today's webinar sponsor is ShareVault, and for those of you who are not yet familiar with our company, we provide cloud-based secure document sharing systems and virtual data rooms that organizations of all types and sizes use for sharing highly confidential documents with external parties. Specifically within the life sciences arena, companies, universities, and other organizations use ShareVault to control and track their sensitive documents being shared with external parties, such as suppliers, manufacturers, and distributors of medical devices. Certainly that's relevant to today's topic. ShareVault is also very commonly used for capital raising, licensing and partnering, M&A, communicating with regulatory advisors, attorneys, and board members of just any place that you're sharing very confidential documents. Over the past 3 years, ShareVault has been recognized for its leadership in the life sciences industry, our customer base in 48 countries, and our contributions to the industry in the form of sponsorship of events like this one. Many of you are already aware that ShareVault service has been chosen by the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, and which is also known as BIO, and 38 other associations for their member benefits program. And that does include a number of associations that have very strong medical device members, are very strong in medical device membership and activities such as Michigan Biomedical Alley in Minnesota, Mass Medic in Massachusetts, and others. So I'd like to invite you to come to ShareVault's website to learn more about our company and our secure document sharing service. Okay, now on to our speaker, Amara Nelson. First of all, as I think you'll pick up today, Maren really enjoys working with medical devices and has developed and released multiple products during her career. Her projects are quite varied, with some using internal resources for manufacturing, some using external resources, and many using both. And the products that Maren's been involved with include Class 1, Class 2, and Class 3 devices. Maren's formal training includes a BS in electrical engineering, an MBA, and Program Manager certification, PMP certification. Before starting her consulting practice, Maren was a senior director at Medtronic Physio Control, where she led the R&D engineering team and was responsible for design, control processes, and the integration to internal and external manufacturing. Maren currently consults on medical product development strategy, including options for manufacturing and supply chain, as well as quality management system implementation and improvements. As you can see, we are very fortunate to have Maren sharing her expertise today. And with that, I'd like to introduce you to Maren Nelson, our guest speaker.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Steve, and welcome to everybody. I'm happy to be here today to talk about an important topic to me and to share the best practices that I've learned. I look forward to your questions and feedbacks as we both continue our learning process. The topics that I wanted to cover today include how do you select a supplier in a way that makes sense for the business and keeps you compliant with the regulatory requirements? In particular, what are the supplier selection criteria for manufacturing that you might want to consider? The three specific ones that I want to talk about today are not necessarily common ones to consider, but I think they're very important to make sure you have a good long-term relationship with the supplier. Those three criteria are ownership, service, and information integration. Finally, I want to talk about what the contracts and agreements look like, or what type of information should go into those contracts and agreements based on the criteria that you've established in the previous steps. And then to talk about how you manage suppliers on an ongoing basis, because as suppliers change and as your business changes, this is a very key aspect of selecting good suppliers. At the end, there'll be a summary and time for questions.
So the supplier selection process starts with what I consider the most important part of getting a good supplier or having a good relationship with the supplier, and that's determining the criteria for the supplier in advance. The FDA 820 requirement is that you be able to evaluate and select potential suppliers, contractors, and consultants on the basis of their ability to meet your specified requirements, including quality requirements. And that evaluation needs to be documented. So the very most important part of doing the supplier selection process is to get your criteria determined in advance. Once you have the criteria determined, you can choose your candidate suppliers. The good practice is to document all the suppliers that you're considering, even the ones that you don't choose. And from a business perspective, this is where you're initiating a relationship with your suppliers. The third step is to evaluate the candidates against those criteria that you've already selected. Again, the key part of that is to document the result. And finally, to make the supplier selection, document the scope of the approval. Not all suppliers are selected to do all of the activities, so you want to make sure that your scope is very clear. You also want to document the review internally and note any concerns or restrictions that you might have regarding the supplier so that you can track those in the future. A primary concept to keep in mind during this whole process is that for medical products, from a regulatory perspective, the owner of the medical product is always accountable, and if you're the medical company, that means you're always accountable. So when you select a supplier, that supplier is acting as a proxy for you. You can't select a manufacturing supplier and then they somehow automatically become responsible. So the term that I've heard used and that I'll use through this presentation for the medical company is the manufacturer of record. So that distinguishes the medical company as the entity that's considered by the regulatory authorities to be the manufacturer, distinct from the company that may actually be doing the manufacturing activities. So when I refer to the manufacturer of record, it's the medical device company. The manufacturer is the supplier that you've selected that's doing the manufacturing activities. So what are some of the supplier criteria that you may look at? Capability and expertise is obviously the first one that people will be looking at. A second one that's often reviewed is the manufacturing processes the supplier has and what certifications. 13485 is a common certification, and there are manufacturing suppliers that are also approved through the FDA. Most people are aware of and very sensitive to intellectual property protection. If you haven't been aware of this, then your company legal team will probably encourage you to look at that. Price and delivery terms are something that may not necessarily fall under the quality management system regulations, but I think it's important to consider all of the criteria that you're looking at in a supplier up front. It's expensive and time-consuming to change suppliers. So if you can get the correct supplier in all aspects up front, that reduces your quality system risk. Delivery terms and the flexibility of the supplier also are a little more on the business side. The three, as I mentioned, that I wanted to talk about today are ownership and the service and information, which in the medical sense is going to be how did you document this, integration of all the information together in your system. So ownership, what do I mean by ownership? Ownership seems like it should be pretty straightforward on the surface. The manufacturer of record is contracting with the suppliers, so the manufacturer of record should own everything. But one reason that we often use external manufacturing is that they have specialized or new technology that's not available inside the medical company. So you may have an external manufacturer that's providing biological 3D printing or working with small pitch parts or even with specialized molding. Those manufacturers have their own intellectual property around the processes and the tools they use to work with those materials. So it's very important to be clear at the beginning who owns which pieces of the intellectual property. Also realize that if you're going with a supplier that owns intellectual property on a certain aspect of the manufacturing, it may be very difficult for you to change your product in the future or even move that product to another manufacturer should that need arise. Manufacturing tools is another key area to address for ownership. Some companies will require you to pay capital up front to purchase the tools. Other companies will purchase the tools themselves and will essentially charge you a fee for using them. Obviously, in the first case, if you need to move your manufacturing, it would be much easier to do than it would be in the second case. Manufacturing processes, again, this comes into the intellectual property aspects to a certain amount, but you want to identify whether the manufacturer's expertise resulted from previous work they've done. And you also want to talk about if they develop expertise in a certain area while you're paying them to develop that expertise. Is that something that they would own in the future, or is that something that your company would own in the future? Inventory ownership is also something that I recommend you look at early in the process. Some cases, companies may be using common or off-the-shelf components across multiple product lines, and they may want to know if they can use those products for you or if they have to maintain a separate inventory. The answer can vary depending upon how critical your device is. There's also an inventory for custom components that would be kept in hand, and part of this also determines who's paid for these components at the point that they're sitting on the supplier's shelf. Ownership of components that are purchased, maybe not per a purchase order, but because the supplier anticipates a higher demand, is also something that should be clarified as you're talking in advance. That's often a huge expense and can cause a lot of friction between the manufacturing company and the medical company if that ownership is not clear. Ownership of the supply chain is a really interesting question and can get very complicated. Obviously, if you've outsourced your build to a manufacturer, it would be far more convenient, if you will, for that manufacturing supplier to be ordering and managing all of the sub-tier suppliers. However, if you have specified to the manufacturing company that you want them to use a particular sub-tier supplier, that may make that relationship a little more complicated. So laying out your supply chain relationship to understand for those sub-tier suppliers that you may have selected, are you doing the ongoing management of that supplier, or are you expecting your primary manufacturing company to do that, is a really important aspect. And finally, when you start talking about ownership, I would recommend that you look at what happens when you have components or product not meeting specs. If you have components that you can't use, who becomes responsible for owning those or for absorbing the cost for those products when they can't be used? Again, this can often become a big source of friction between the medical company and the manufacturing company if that expectation is not clearly identified in advance. If you've been doing product development or product manufacturing for a while, I'm sure we all have instances where product was received in and it didn't meet the specifications, and there ensued a battle about who was actually responsible for paying for those. Finally, the manufacturing risk assessment and who is responsible for completing that activity, which is required from a regulatory perspective, should also be clarified up front. I wanted to talk briefly about the difference between off-the-shelf and custom components, because to me this is a key notion when you're talking about manufacturing products. Off-the-shelf or standard components are those items that can be ordered through catalogs or online, and the key thing here is the specifications for those products are designed and manufactured by somebody else than the medical company. The fact, or how those components meet their specifications, is the responsibility of that supplier or the supplier that controls the specifications. The good news about off-the-shelf or standard parts is they generally provide cost savings because someone has already done the development work, and that somebody else is controlling the specification and the verification activities, which is a positive. But it can also be a negative, because if you want to use that part and it's not exactly what you want, your ability to change that component is very limited. Custom components allow the manufacturer of record to optimize the design, and in that case the manufacturer of record controls the specification. That means they can choose a different supplier and transfer that specification to them, and it gives them more control. Again, the downside is that that is typically a more expensive way to get a component that you need. So companies generally try to use off-the-shelf components when they can, and if not, go to a custom component. There's often situations where an off-the-shelf component sort of migrates to be a custom component, and it's not always clear that that's happening. There's no physical change in the part, but if you're using an off-the-shelf component in a way that's not consistent with the manufacturer's specs, i.e. you're using a part that's outside the temperature range, you're using a component at a higher voltage, you've essentially made that off-the-shelf component a custom component. And because you're using it in that way, the manufacturer of the standard component is not responsible for those aspects of the component that you've chosen to use outside the spec. I've often gotten the question of, well, we tested these components and they're only supposed to work up to 55 degrees, but we tested them at 60 degrees and they all seem to work fine. That works to a certain extent, but realize that the manufacturer of the component can change it at any time and may make a process change or a design material change. The component still meets the 55-degree specification, but it no longer works up to 60, and they don't have to notify you about that change unless you've asked for more detail in your contract with them. So that can be a very risky proposition if you're using components outside of their spec. I also wanted to talk a little bit about service. I have a broader definition of service than just repair, but I think that when you're a medical company, you ought to consider what you're doing for service at the same time that you're considering your manufacturing supplier. Your manufacturing supplier will have a lot of expertise and knowledge about what goes into fixing a product that you may not have internally to the company, and it may be very important for you to access that information in multiple ways. So service includes customer service, which is customer calls and questions, customer call escalation, and it also has the need for the medical company to create and improve on their customer scripts. The part that becomes more significant for your manufacturing partner is to think about how you're going to handle the returns of product that comes back that was not used. Sometimes customers handle or order product, it comes in the door and they go, oh, this wasn't what I wanted, and they ship it back right away. If that's going to happen, do those products go back to the manufacturer? Is that where you'd like them returned? Would you like them returned to the company? It's an important question to ask, and there's multiple ways to address it. Device repair is the big one. Again, you will have returns of used product if you're going to be doing repair. You'll need technicians and people to diagnose and repair the product, which also means they need the service stock and components to repair the product. You want to be able to create and improve your repair processes, and this is often very sticky. The repair processes are similar to the rework processes in manufacturing, so there's a lot of overlap there, and having a manufacturing partner that can also help you or is willing to help you at least develop the repair processes is a very valuable thing. Finally, once the device is repaired, that repaired or new product needs to be provided to the customer. And then you need to update the device history record. When products are built at your manufacturing supplier, there's a record of the device manufacturing history that's kept and maintained, and that is a regulatory requirement. When there are changes made to that device in the field or changes made after manufacturing, such as a repair activity, somehow that amount of information or that information needs to get back into the device history record. The final area to think of for your service provider as you're thinking about your manufacturing supplier is the post-market activities, such as the device history record accuracy, and if there should be the unlikely situation where there was a problem in manufacturing or a problem with a component, and you need to access the DHR information for the products that were built in order to determine what the scope of an issue might be. Talking in advance about what your access time is to the DHR information if the manufacturer is holding that data is really important. Having somebody say, yeah, we can get back on that search criteria to you after a couple of weeks, probably is not going to meet your regulatory requirements. So the last topic that I wanted to talk about was information integration. I've mentioned several different documents as we've talked through the course of this presentation, and the areas that I'll highlight here include the device master record specifications, how you have set up your component numbers and your component revisions may or may not be a good fit with the manufacturing partner. So there may be actually a translation between the part numbers you've established and the component numbers that your manufacturer uses during the manufacturing process. That can also have an impact on how the material tracking records look. And then finally, device master record specifications, or the recipe for the device, often go through changes, and you want to understand how your manufacturing partner tracks those changes, how they make sure that proposed changes don't get into production too early, particularly if they're working with you at the prototype stage, and what their control processes are around those documents. I will make a note here that often the device master record specifications, since they are the recipe for the device, are very confidential records and confidential documents and should be handled with in a manner that's appropriate to confidential documents. The second area of information is the manufacturing processes and the validation results for those processes. That could be document references and revisions for the processes, for the manufacturing risk assessment, for process validation, for incoming inspection and receiving protocols, and for the material receipts of the information of the components coming in. Again, configuration control around those. The processes will be in development at the manufacturer, so they will have both draft versions of those as well as versions that are controlled and approved. The risk assessment, the PFMEA, I mentioned already. And just as on the DMR, the change management and effectivity around the processes and validation is important to understand and to make sure that as a manufacturer of record, you can demonstrate that you know those changes are in control. The actual manufacturing documents, or the in-process documents, would include the acceptance criteria for the device, which becomes part of the device history record, material receipts, if there are any issues during production, how the rework activities are documented and associated with the device records is very important. And then as part of the ongoing information to look at from the supplier, the production metrics on the products to look for yield issues, for potential quality issues, for efficiencies in the process are very important to discuss up front. And then finally, the post-market documents, again, the device history record review for the released products and where that information actually is maintained and kept. The manufacturer often has information on when components are going to be obsolete or when changes in materials are coming that will require design changes on the manufacturer of record side. So those notices of component obsolescence and how much advance warning can your supplier provide you about those types of changes is a very key business component of your relationship with your manufacturing supplier. Finally, you want to establish an ongoing rapport so that if the manufacturing supplier sees opportunities for product improvement, product efficiency, cost reductions, risk reduction in the product, that they are encouraged to bring those forward to you, and so that you can look at that information and share it with them. So this was a lot of information that we talked about just to establish the criteria that you're going to be looking at for selecting a manufacturing partner. Once you have that information, you need to codify it and take the time to put these detailed expectations and the quality criteria into a contract or agreement of some sort, so that you have a legal record of these expectations. And that legal record is important for the company and for business operation. It's also important from a regulatory perspective. Again, you are in charge of the supplier, and it's your responsibility to show that you've established adequate control over the supplier. So all these areas that we've talked about and that are deep bulleted here are areas you should think about for details in the contract. Contracts take a lot of time. If you do a contract quickly because you need to get going and you just want to get something in place, realize that you're taking a risk as a business that what's in the contract may not be adequate. I'll make a note there. The last bullet on there was to take the time to define the escalation and change paths, so that if an issue comes up, you at least have a plan for how you're going to resolve it. So the company responsibility in all of this is that you need to, and this is the medical device company, you need to identify what your control points are. And that includes control of the confidential information that you're sharing with the supplier. In the background, you want to be able to understand the company options for the future. Going with a supplier that's got a new and unique technology might be a great business choice right now, but it may limit your options for the future with that product. And the last thing, just as a reminder, this is a partnership between you and a manufacturing supplier. That partnership will work better if you take the time to identify and be aware of the supplier needs and the supplier concerns, and to address those as well as you do the contracts and the agreements. So briefly, to go over managing suppliers, you may have picked up that I am a big fan of doing a little bit of work more frequently. So the key word in managing suppliers is that you want to be continually thinking about how is this supplier doing. Some of the more formal activities that people talk about, you can do audits, both as a part of selecting the suppliers and as a part of ongoing management. You can do ongoing monitoring of the received product. Again, those production metrics that I mentioned earlier, what are the current yields for the product? What types of trends are you seeing in terms of issues or test failures, can give you great early indications of what's going on, so you can make a small correction rather than making a large correction later. It's after the fact, but it's important to look at the field performance of your products to get an assessment of how the suppliers are doing. Sometimes issues don't show up until the product's been in the field for a year or more. Going back and reviewing against the information and the criteria that you put in the contracts and agreements is a great way to keep everybody aligned with what the original intent of the relationship was meant to be. And again, if a supplier is suggesting improvements to you, many times that helps their business and it helps your business. So a timely response to those suggested improvements is also important. And then you also need to be continually checking in with your medical company to make sure that everything is still making sense from your perspective. So make sure that you still need the service and components. business changes happen all the time. Different skill sets come into the company. Different products are brought into the line. So looking at a particular supplier to see whether they're still needed is a good business exercise. Is the supplier still meeting the expectations? Maybe they've exceeded your expectations and you actually want to give them new opportunities and have them provide new services for you. Or is the manufacturer not meeting expectations and you really need to take action quickly for them? So in summary, you form a relationship between the manufacturer of record and the supplier. You want to clearly understand and document your expectations or your criteria in advance. And again, the key word here is document. You want to document when you finalize those expectations in a contract or a legal agreement. And you want to be aware when expectations change so that you can, again, go back and update the legal documents. So your legal documents always reflect the state of your business. So that's the information that I had for you today. And I think, Steve, are you there?
Yep, I'm here. Maren, thank you for this invaluable and detailed information that you've just presented to our audience. Speaking for them and everyone involved, we very much appreciate the time and effort you put into organizing and presenting all of this content. So we're now going to move to the Q&A part of the webinar, so stay on with us because there are questions. Maren's going to respond to audience questions that have already been submitted, but it's not too late. If anyone in our audience still wants to submit additional questions, please do so through the GoToMeeting control panel. There's a question box there that you can click on and enter your question. As I mentioned previously, we'll try to cover as many questions as possible during the remaining time. But if we don't get to all of them, we'll forward the unanswered ones to Maren so she can respond directly. So here's the first question, and I think this ties back to what you were just talking about a few minutes ago. Should I keep looking for better, cheaper, or other suppliers after the product is in production, or are there too many risks in doing that?
I think it's always important to make sure that you have an eye out for other suppliers. Even if you've got a product in production, there are often changes in the business model. There's changes in the supplier's capability, supplier expertise. I actually found it very interesting when Medtronic bought Covidien last year, or when those two companies merged, because there, I think, were a lot of medical companies that were using Covidien as a supplier for some of their products, and with that business change, now Medtronic competitors were buying from what was essentially a new Medtronic company. So even with the mergers and acquisitions market out there, there are changes in companies that may make it desirable for you to change to a different supplier. It's not, I mean, it's a new supplier selection process. It's burdensome for the business to do it because you go through the selection process again, you go through the legal process, you go through the setting up of a new supplier with, transferring your documentation over and figuring out, are they going to keep the DHR? So you have all those questions to go through, so I wouldn't do it lightly. But there are many times when the business advantages to changing to a new supplier make it advantageous to do that.
Okay, thank you. Here's another one that says, I think you mentioned that there's an FDA list of suppliers, and if so, how easy is it to find that? Is it as simple as a Google search?
There are suppliers that have been audited by the FDA as manufacturing or having adequate manufacturing processes. I don't know where that list is at, It's similar to the approval that you would get for a 13485 certified manufacturer.
Next question. At what point, this is specifically for your consulting activities, in fact, there are a couple of questions along that line. At what point in development do you usually come in and consult?
I have come in at all different stages in the company. So I do tend to work with a lot of startups and help them get their sort of basic quality management system processes in place. I am such a huge believer in documenting as you go and finding lightweight tools that allow you to capture the information without necessarily getting sort of overcome in the administrative part of capturing that information. I guess the answer is wherever you're at, I can provide value.
There's a related question that says, do you help companies actually select suppliers and work with them in that process?
I do. Some areas of manufacturing I definitely have more experience in than others, but I certainly can help with sitting down and identifying the criteria up front that you'd want to have for a supplier.
Another question is, and this ties back to the continual process related to updating, how often should suppliers be audited?
That depends on the supplier. I didn't have time to get into it here, but my recommendation when you're doing a manufacturing process as a manufacturer of record is to create a high-level manufacturing flow of the entire process that identifies all of the suppliers that you've got in place and looks at how critical those suppliers are. The audit time basically depends upon what the risk is associated with the supplier. The ballpark is 1 to 2 years, but the answer, like so much in medical devices, is it depends.
There's a question here that's an interesting one. Can you, without mentioning names, maybe describe 1 or 2 horror stories that you're aware of, if you assume have some?
I can give a couple of examples where, and these get sort of into nuts and bolts and just indicate how intelligent you need to be as a company. There's a couple of complications that have come up, particularly if you're aware of any of the private labeling laws and the concerns with private labeling. Probably 10 to 15 years ago, a number of medical companies would have somebody else develop a device and they would put their brand on them. And so you'd see, a thermometer or, a company, and it would be built by somebody else. And it was called private labeling. Canada, in particular, and the EU as well, have said that if your name is on the product, you are the manufacturer of record. And of course, if you're the manufacturer of record and private labeling a product in Canada and you're private labeling the same product in the US, your labeling requirements are very different. And so you can very quickly start to propagate SKU numbers for products based on different labeling requirements, even though the product, the actual medical device itself is the same. And that can cause a huge amount of business expense in the company. One of the other things that can happen is if you're Say you've got an SpO2 sensor, or you've got a product that somebody else is manufacturing but that you're using as a part of your product. For example, if you had, maybe it was training software or something like that. This gets into the off-the-shelf and the custom. Since you're using that product, it's an off-the-shelf product from your perspective, and you don't control the specification. When you signed up with that manufacturer, you maybe were going to 3 different countries and you needed 3 different languages. Now you want to expand your market and you want to go out to another 3 or 4 different countries with that product, but you don't own the spec and you need that accessory to be localized in those other languages. If the manufacturer isn't interested in localizing in those other languages, you're sort of stuck. So that's why this decision between off-the-shelf, it's somebody else's spec, is great for moving quickly and getting started up because somebody else has already done the work. But if you really need a change on that product to expand your market, you may have locked yourself into a corner because they don't have any obligation to change it for you.
I have a question actually that ties back into what you were just discussing. Other than what you just mentioned, what other aspects should people keep in mind when they're thinking of their device internationally? I'm not sure you covered that in the presentation. So are there other things, if that product's going to be in Canada or Europe or in Asia, in Japan, other geographies, when you're selecting suppliers, are there some other things to keep in mind as well?
There are, and a lot of those would come. So if you're going to other countries, there's often environmental constraints, like Canada has requirements around BPA labeling. Japan has different sterilization requirements. Labeling requirements often are different between different countries because they're looking for different certifications from a legal perspective. So if you are looking at a manufacturer, what you want is somebody that can help you meet the requirements that you need from all the countries. For example, if you're going to Europe and you need RoHS, one of the requirements that become very important in material tracking is to be able to show the amount of lead and the other hazardous chemicals that were contained in the components that were coming into the factory for being supplied. So there's another area where the data or the documentation integration becomes very important to be able to show.
Okay, another question, and again, I encourage our audience to we still have about 10 minutes or so, maybe a little bit less, so I encourage the audience to keep asking questions, but here's some others. How many suppliers do I need to consider before choosing one?
The answer may be 1 to probably a practical maximum is 4 or 5. If you are looking at a supplier and you can only, you've looked at one supplier and they meet all your criteria, then that's all you need to look at. Generally, it's good to at least have a couple because that shows more due diligence in casting a wider net to see who might be available. But if there's only one that's even a close choice, then considering one is fine.
And another question, what should I do if I selected suppliers without writing down the criteria? So that sounds like it's already been done.
I would, as quickly as possible, write down the criteria that you used and capture the information that you had written down or had done informally at the time. The longer you go before clearly identifying, particularly in your quality management system, that you followed the appropriate process for selecting the supplier, the less credibility you have and the more risk you have.
And another question is, this brings in a third party. You've got the supplier, I'm paraphrasing the question, but you've got the supplier and you've got the manufacturer of record, and then you've got a shipper, a UPS or a FedEx of that component that may go directly to a clinic or a hospital. And if that component is, shipment is, disappears, gets lost, somehow doesn't make it on time, or there's some issue around that shipment, is it my responsibility as a manufacturer of record to take care of that, or is that the supplier's responsibility, or is that part of the contracts and agreements that you mentioned during the presentation?
Well, it's your responsibility as the manufacturer of record to understand what the process is and to have defined a process for dealing with that situation. So you can't just assume that it's going to be it's going to be FedEx or UPS, or it's going to be the manufacturing company that shipped it out. You have to explicitly define and write down what would happen in a situation like that, which is obviously very foreseeable. So the way, again, that I would recommend capturing that information is you can use the PFMEA process or a high-level flow of your manufacturing process, which may include everything from components to delivery to the customer. You can tack service on there if you want, so that when it happens, it's not an unknown situation. It's either written into the contract that Federal Express is responsible, or Federal Express isn't going to take your business and be responsible. So even though you'd like them to be responsible, you know that you're responsible. But it is written into those contracts and agreements that I discussed.
And the last question that I have, other than and if the audience doesn't submit any other ones, but it's maybe a great closing question, ties back to you, Maren. The question is, I don't know where you live and work, but do you work across the country or just locally in your consulting?
Well, I live and work in Seattle, and I frankly have been fortunate enough to have most of my business here. But I've also worked in Canada and a couple of other states in the U.S., and so I'm happy to do some traveling, and I'm also happy to do some work remotely.
Okay. Well, on that note, I think we're going to wrap up. If you still have any questions, please submit them, but we're about to wind this down. I'd like to remind our audience that copies of the slides and a recording of this webinar will be made available, and in the next few days you'll receive an email with instructions on how to get access to them. And again, that's how to get access to the slides and to the recording. There will also be a white paper that will be generated from this webinar, and you'll get a notice when that white paper is available. And I did just see another question come in. Actually, I guess it was just a compliment that says it's a thank you to you, Maren, and a very interesting presentation. So I'd like to reinforce that. Thank you so much for the time and effort you put into organizing and presenting this information. Thank you very much.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you all for listening.
So in closing, on behalf of Maren Nelson and ShareVault, I'd like to thank everyone in our audience for your time and questions, and I wish everyone a very good rest of the day. And we look forward to seeing you again, hopefully in the future, at another webinar. Thanks, everyone.